Well, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here today. I don't think I need this one, do I, John? Because I've got my little mic here. My name's Dave. I'm one of the members of the church family here at Ross, and really grateful to you for giving me this opportunity to speak this morning about Jonah, the reluctant prophet, and responding to God's call. I'm going to start with an admission, and I have to admit that I've never given the book of Jonah a great deal of thought. Of course, I have always been aware from childhood of the story, and apparently I discovered that it's one of the best known children's stories within the whole Bible, and a fact in a sense that surprises me when you consider it's about a great fish swallowing a little man whole and then spewing him up on a beach after failing to digest him for 3 days and nights. It's hardly the stuff of bedtime stories. So I set myself the task of going a lot deeper into this very short book in the Old Testament. Jonah was one of the 12 minor prophets, just 4 very short chapters. And this morning we're going to be thinking particularly around the first chapter, when we read about when Jonah received God's call and his response to it. So what follows is not a theological treatise. I'm not qualified or clever enough to deliver such a thing. So what I'm going to be sharing is based upon what I've come across on what turned out for me to be a really compelling journey of discovery, and which I share with you all today. And it also gives me an opportunity to share just a little something of my own experience. One thing I did discover, or I felt anyway, about Jonah is that he is was a man of extremes, and I could imagine that if Jonah nowadays was to decide he wanted to hire a cottage or a little place to get away from it all, this is the kind of thing he'd come up with. And that's actually, probably a lot of you will have noticed, that's on the road to Ross, between here and Ross, on the main road. And I've got no idea what it is, but it did tickle me a bit when I saw that. But just for a moment, and continuing with the theme of bringing the past back into the present time, I'm going to ask you to cast your minds back 2,750 odd years, if you would, and imagine the following phone conversation. Hello, Jonah here. Oh, hello, Lord. No, that's fine. If you do detect any reticence in my voice, it's probably because I always get a little bit anxious when you call me. Why? Well, yes, I know I'm a prophet, but let me give you just one example, Lord. That time recently when, you remember you told me to go to that wicked king of Israel, Jeroboam II, and instead of getting me to tell him that you were going to strike him down for his wickedness, which I thought you should have done, by the way, I had to tell him that you loved him and the people of Israel, and that you were going to bless him, restore him, and even extend his borders. And what happened? You kept your promise, of course, but he just carried on in the same old way. Yes, I know that you are a God of love and compassion. I just think, Lord, that sometimes you love people too much for your own good, and they just throw it back in your face. Anyway, Lord, what's the next thing you have me to do? You can't be serious. Nineveh? Call the people to repentance? Oh, Lord, you must be joking. These people aren't just wicked, they're professionally wicked. They're vicious people. Israel's most dreaded enemy, Lord. They'll never listen to me, Lord. And Lord, they don't deserve your love and forgiveness. Please, Lord, don't ask me to do this. Please. Yes, I know I should trust you, Lord, but okay, I'll think about it. I'll get back to you. Okay. Bye. Yeah, I love you too. Okay, there's a bit of poetic license there, but you probably get the idea. So what's the book of Jonah about? Well, essentially, it's about God's love and his care, and he'd rather forgive and save than punish and destroy. And unlike the other books of prophecy, Jonah is written as a story. As such, this book has been taken by many as fact, history. It actually happened, history with a moral, and by others as a parable. And there's been much theological debate around this. And there are, I've discovered, sperm whales and large sharks that are evident in the eastern Mediterranean and as such are capable of swallowing a man whole. Historically, some scholars have favoured the allegorical approach, and others, such as Augustine, have favoured a more literal approach. And coming more up to date, a prominent and highly respected Bible teacher, David Paulson, would certainly have taken the literal position and pointed out that clearly Jesus himself believed in the story as Jonah as an historical event, making reference in Matthew 12, verse 39, to Jesus' words about the sign of Jonah, and drawing parallels to Jonah's existence in the belly of the fish for 3 days and nights, to his own pending resurrection 3 days after his crucifixion. And Jonah, incidentally, also came from an area near to Nazareth and was a local hero to the Nazarenes, so Jesus would certainly have been very aware of him. But whatever position is taken, there is absolutely no doubt about the main message. It's a message to the Israelites who had become an inward-looking people, failing in their duty to the nations, and a message that was directed to those who were running away from the missionary task. And it is a message for all of us here today. Rosemary Nixon, who wrote from a conservative theological standpoint in her study, The Message of Jonah, she wrote, "We need perhaps to remind ourselves that the book of Jonah does not reach its climax by asking the reader, 'Do you believe that the great fish was historical or allegorical?' But rather, God asks, 'And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and so much cattle?'" But my task this morning is to explore with you all this story of how just one man, who essentially thought he knew better than God, tried to disobey God's orders and ran away from what God called him to do. And our thoughts this morning are to set the scene for what we're going to be learning over the next few weeks as we discover so much about God's love and understanding for us, his children here today, who either struggle themselves in this direction or who will be used by God to help those who have gone astray to get back onto the right path. So let's look for a moment at the context within which this story is told, and then at the reasons perhaps why Jonah had for running away from God's call upon him. Nineveh was the most important city in Assyria, and it was the rising world power of the day, and it became the capital of the vast Assyrian Empire eventually. And the Assyrian rule was outstanding in its ruthlessness and cruelty. The prophet Nahum describes Nineveh as a city guilty of evil plots against God, exploitation of the helpless, cruelty in war and enforcement. A standard practice was literally to impale those who got in the way. Idolatry, prostitution, and witchcraft. Assyria ruled by terror and was Israel's most dreaded enemy. And Syria, like all Israelites, and Jonah, like all Israelites, had grown up hating and fearing the Assyrians. So who were the prophets, by the way? We're talking about these 12 minor prophets. But the prophets depicted in the Old Testament were just ordinary men who heard from God. And the heaviness of the message they received was such that they felt compelled to pass it on. They were to challenge what their audience was doing wrong and to encourage when they were doing right. In the Old Testament, Israel was pretty often doing wrong, so the prophet's role was mainly a challenging one, which didn't make them very popular, and they were seen as doom and gloom merchants. And it's against this background that Jonah received his calling from God. He knew this was a tough and difficult to understand call. But Jonah was used to unusual calls, as demonstrated by his obedience to God, however questioning that might have been, when he passed on God's message of extending King Jeroboam's borders. A leader, by the way, who had no devotion to God whatsoever, but who, despite his own wickedness, God used through the king's strategic and military success to alleviate the suffering of the Israelite people whose very existence was under threat from warring neighbours. And notice the big picture here that Jonah wouldn't have seen at the time, that God was able to use the king's personal ambition and a person who lived outside of God's will to bring deliverance for his people, because God is in control. It's interesting. So why do we think Jonah was so reluctant to obey God's call? Well, I think there could have been a number of reasons. Fear was one, understandable, but there's other evidence to suggest that Jonah wasn't a particularly fearful person. For example, in verse 12 we read that he was willing to be thrown overboard into the stormy sea to save the ship's crew once he realized that he was the cause of the terrifying storm. So fear perhaps wasn't the primary reason, although I'm sure there was something in there. So could it have been racial prejudice, possibly? It's common in his day. Jonah was one of the chosen people, and he wouldn't have been able to have imagined how God could care about other nations, especially one as vile and as idolatrous as Assyria. Why would non-Jews hear about the love and compassion of the God of Israel, he might have thought. So that was a possible reason. And then the notion of it being a lost cause might have gone through his mind. The Assyrians, far too wicked and far too gone to sully himself with. Also, little Israel were next on the Assyrian hit list, so why would Jonah want to go and preach to these wicked and threatening people? That could have been a reason. Or perhaps it was the issue of Jonah's own allegiance to God and a sense of protecting God's interests. Could God seriously be wanting to reach out to this lost nation? No, indeed, we might imagine him saying, "This time you've really got it wrong, God. I thought you were making a mistake over that issue with King Jeroboam, although I can kind of see now where you were going with that one. But this, no, you've really got it wrong. They'll just throw your love back in your face." Well, whatever the reason, Jonah was going to have none of it. And so he boarded a ship in Joppa that was headed for Tarshish, and that was hundreds of miles in the opposite direction from Nineveh. That should sort it. How foolish of Jonah to think that any distance could separate him from the love or will of God. So there we have it. Jonah doesn't like what he hears God asking him to do. He thinks he knows better. He runs away. And then he becomes very unstuck. And God, as we know, relentlessly pursues Jonah and intervenes in a most extraordinary way to bring him back into God's perfect plan for him. Jonah is brought to the point of repentance, and next week Ian will be unpacking what that involved. But that's not quite the end of today's episode, because I want us to stop and reflect for a few minutes on the fact that as followers of Jesus, we can and we should expect to hear God's call upon us. Each one of us, every day, every week, every year of our lives. And to consider how, in his love for us, he will pursue us if we try to ignore that or flee from him. And this isn't about an angry, vengeful God giving us a hard time because we're trying to thwart his plan. His plan, by the way, will never be thwarted. We might cause it to be adjusted, but don't ever believe that we can avoid God working his purpose out in our lives. And why should we ever want that anyway? There are so many references and stories within the Bible pointing to God's love for us and, for want of a better term, his stickability. In Psalm 139, we read, "I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, if I dwell by the farthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me and your strength will support me. I could ask the darkness to hide me and the light around me to become night. But even in the darkness I can't hide from you. To you the night shines as bright as day. Darkness and light are the same to you." And in Luke 15 there are a number of parables that Jesus tells of how he will seek the one that is lost or strayed. The parables of the lost coin, the one sheep out of 100, the prodigal son. Jeff Lucas once wrote, "The God we follow is not a God of divine impassibility, unmoved, emotionless, unperturbed by human suffering. What I see, and especially in the book of Jonah, is where the main theme of the book is the passion of God, is the one who relentlessly pursues a fugitive." And I'm so glad he does. Because many, many years ago, I was such a person. I very rarely talk about this, and Sheila Shepherd would be really proud because she's been nagging me to do this for a long time. And I said no. But recently, and for the first time in years, I did share in Sunday at 4, where, by the way, an awful lot of special stories do get told, a little of my own story of running from God as a much, much younger man, and how he ran after me and brought me home. So I know from first hand something of what this is all about, and I can speak of the sadness and the pain of those few wilderness years, and of how, despite my own confusion and problems, Jesus never left my side and gently but relentlessly kept me safe, never let me go. And how, so young as I was then, I was serving him in a unique ministry of caring and evangelism. And through my running, I sacrificed that ministry. But how, decades on, I can look back and see how God caught hold of me, rescued me, and slowly but surely, as I grew stronger, revealed his adjusted plan for me, and how over the years he gave me back a ministry of caring, which I'm to this very day still able to serve him through in a small way within this very church family. And this ministry I have now, by the way, is the most important to me than any I've ever had. So God doesn't just make good, he somehow makes good with interest. He's such a special, loving Father, and I love him so much. And why do I mention all of this? Because running away from God, whatever the reasons or circumstances, the details don't really matter. But whatever the reasons or circumstances, running away from God demands a heart response, not just from the one who's running from the call of God, but from those who will accompany him or her on their journey home. You see, I lost a lot of people who just couldn't cope. But I did have a handful of people, mostly friends, but also others who just wouldn't let go of me. And that included 4 ministers, 3 Baptists and 1 Methodist. Sounds like a joke, doesn't it? But it's not. All of whom, over all these years, they weren't all together, it wasn't a seminar, but over all these years, they got to know of my whole sad story. And I specifically remember one of them telling me, Dave, I believe in a God of forgiveness, not condemnation. I was never in the belly of a big fish, but I was in a pit. And one very special person who'd rubbed shoulders with me more years ago than I can remember wrote to me at the time and told me of a vision that she had been given where she'd seen me desperately trying to climb out from that pit of despair. But I just kept sliding back. And then she saw Jesus standing at the edge of the pit with his hand outstretched and enabling me to place my hand in his so he could draw me out. And this also is important because although I knew in my heart that God had forgiven me, I found it so hard to forgive myself. And as the years and years rolled by, and this is about 4 decades ago, remember, I still struggle with it. To a point where just once in a while the devil would point his accusing finger at me and unsettle me and make me wonder, had I truly been forgiven? And at times, all those years on, I would still feel the need to share with anyone who was close to me, almost, I guess, as a way of cleansing myself. Until I came here with my family over 20 years ago now. And yes, somehow I still needed to offload, I suppose in a spirit of honesty, all that had happened all those many years ago to the ministers who were here at the time, Charles Crossland and Tim Shelley, and both of whom lovingly and gently, but very firmly, told me that God had dealt with the past all those many years ago. And I now really had to let go. And I did. And the relief was amazing. And all the things that my friends, Karen, a man within this church family who'd somehow sensed something of what I was still struggling with from time to time, and who gave me a book on the prodigal son by Henry Newen, and others who loved me and tried to assure me over all these things, were voiced by Tim and Charles. And I spoke earlier about how when we turn back to Jesus and stop running away, he's able and he will adjust his plan to enable this. I am a totally flawed individual. I really am. We all are. But like we heard recently, my little friend Jason, who we hear about from time to time, I can stand up here this morning and not just theorize about how God can put such a flawed individual back on track, but I can say with authority that I've lived that journey of forgiveness. And maybe that gives the likes of myself and Jason and anybody else in that kind of situation a special authenticity. So when Jason's sharing his story with addicts on the street, or I'm talking to you here today, or to others on a one-to-one basis, we're not just saying, look, this is what we understand about God and this is what God can do for you. What we're saying is, God did this for me, and I know it's true. Yes, truly, God is able to work together to make all good things good for all those who love him. So to finish, I'd like us to remember two things. If we go off track and lose sight of God's call upon us, be assured that, as with Jonah, there's always a way back. We just need to take hold of God's loving and forgiving hand and make a response. And secondly, if any of us see a Jonah out there who's clearly struggling, reach out to him or her, because you might just be the one who Jesus uses to lead that person home. Amen.